Welcome to the Contagious Code podcast, where we dive deep into code, learn practical skills, celebrate the beauty of engineering, and eliminate imposter syndrome. I'm Tejas Kumar, and I've been building on the web for over 20 years at places like Vercel, Spotify, Zeta, and more. Today, my guest is Shruti Balasa, an expert, consultant, and educator of Tailwind CSS. Tailwind CSS is a utility-first CSS framework that helps you write extremely fast CSS and helps you write CSS extremely fast. What does that mean? Well, Tailwind is atomic, meaning with Tailwind, you write one class name as a class attribute, and that equates to one CSS rule. So if you add the class name flex to an element, it becomes display flex in a style sheet. And it's one rule to one class name. This has led to some criticism because some would say, oh, then the class names get really, really long and unreadable, while others swearing by it, claiming that it gives them a real tailwind, meaning they've never felt they were able to move faster in writing applications that just work. Tailwind also has fast performance benefits at runtime when your users use your page because you only ever ship rules like display flex one time. You never ship display flex more than once if you're using Tailwind CSS. Whereas in more traditional CSS systems, you typically write a rule like display flex in multiple class name declarations for multiple classes and IDs and others. So Tailwind CSS has a bunch of trade-offs, and we capture the nuance of all these trade-offs in our deep dive discussion with its expert Shruti Balasa today. This is a real fun deep dive, and we talk about cases where Tailwind is good, cases where Tailwind isn't helpful, some ways Tailwind can add value, some ways it detracts value, and most importantly, how it works on the inside using its just-in-time compiler and other tricks. This is a real treasure trove of information, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Now, it's important to emphasize that this is separate to my day job, but I'd love to offer this to all of you at zero cost. And the way we can do that is through partners and sponsors. So let's take a moment to acknowledge them. The Contagious Code podcast is partnered with Code Crafters. Code Crafters teaches developers how to get better at the tools they use every day and the languages they use every day. With Code Crafters, you re-implement things like Redis, Git, Docker, tools we use in a language that you know or want to get better at, like JavaScript or Python. By doing this, you get better at JavaScript or Python or whatever you choose, and you also understand the tool by implementing it from scratch in this language. It's a really great way to learn. They have a generous free tier, but you could get 40% off if you use the link in the show notes. That's tej.as/codecrafters. The Contagious Code podcast is also partnered with stately.ai. Stately is a great way to visualize the flow of state across your application using state machines and state charts. You can then export these state charts to actual code where you fill in the business logic and create an application. If you'd like to give that a try, go to stately.ai. Finally, the Contagious Code podcast is partnered with That Conference. That Conference is a family-style conference that happens in a water park twice a year in Wisconsin and in Texas, and we often give away free tickets. If you want to attend that conference, share this episode on social media, and you will enter a raffle to do so. Thanks for sticking around, and now for my discussion with Shruti Balasa. Shruti Balasa, thank you for coming on the podcast. You're a Tailwind CSS expert. You've got courses, you've got a YouTube channel. There's so much going on. I'm so excited that you made the time to come talk to me today and dive deep into Tailwind. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting Tejas. I'm just thrilled. I'm excited to be on your podcast.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of things that people learn. When we last talked in Bangalore, you came and picked me up from WeWork and we went and had dinner. I learned so much from just that short amount of time talking to you. So I'm very excited that we'll dive into some things that I think a lot of people haven't heard of. But before we do that,
Right.
Can we maybe do a introduction to you and where you come from and finding that Tailwind specialization, I think is a great place to start, right? Because there's so many different things. I've looked at your YouTube channel. You've done some work with PHP. There's full stack. You're a full stack developer by trade. There's so much. So let's talk about sort of finding Tailwind and then get into Tailwind after that.
Yes. So I am a full stack developer and a course creator. That is a tech educator. So I create courses, I write ebooks and everything. So how Tailwind happened was, it's just, I was following a lot of tech people on Twitter. So, the latest tech that people are using keeps coming up on your feed. And at one point I had to just revamp my personal site. And I had seen Tailwind enough. So I was like, yeah, I'm good at CSS. It's not that I don't know how to position elements or something like that, that's not the issue, because I see a lot of people jumping into Tailwind because they're not good at CSS. I have used CSS I had already used CSS for like 6 to 8 years of my life. It's pretty good at it, but I kept seeing that Tailwind keeps coming up. A lot of people are liking it. So I just went to the website to see, okay, what is this all about? And it was not even version 2 by then, or maybe it was just starting. It was still version 1 point something. And the very first thing on the homepage, right, if you see the landing page of Tailwind, even today, it's pretty similar, is, the automatically, like, you're just using small, simple utility classes and you're able to see the changes there, right? I wanted Tailwind yesterday. That's how I felt when I looked at it, right? This is, what I need. I don't need context switching. I'm so happy if everything is in HTML. I don't have to think about the class names. Okay, this is amazing. I had obviously used Bootstrap before, and back then it was not even Bootstrap version 5 or 4 even. And then there were only 3 padding options and 3 margin options, and the only way to style a card. There were no 2 ways to do that. And to customize that style, you had to go and override, use these important, stuff to override those. And it was a pain to customize. But when I saw Tailwind, I was like, okay, this is amazing. Instantly, I fell in love with it. And I said, I'm using this. That's all. There's, no second thoughts at all. And I started using it for my personal project, and I was freelancing. I was developing websites for clients back then. So I started using it for them also. Your clients obviously don't care what technology you use. And I saw that initially it took me a while to learn those classes, learn those class names, like what, you obviously reach out for the regular CSS property names and everything. But then once I got used to it, I saw that for my 3rd and 4th project, I was way faster already. And then back then there was one thing. I wouldn't really use any frameworks like React or Vue, because my websites were usually static, very simple, maybe 2-3 pages. All I needed was a couple of HTML and CSS files. I didn't want to pick a framework for that, and I realized that there was no tutorial or there was no documentation of how to install Tailwind without Post CSS. I didn't even know what Post CSS was because I never needed it. So then I searched a lot, and for me to get it to work without using Post CSS took a while. I said, hey, nobody has created a video on this. Let me do one. And I created a YouTube video on, how to install Tailwind CSS without Post CSS. And that started, it didn't go viral as such, but a lot of viewers started viewing it. And then I did another video where you could install Tailwind CSS with Post CSS also, but no other framework, something like that. It was very simple stuff. And then, how to design a contact form with Tailwind. So those videos started getting more viewership compared to all other simple videos that I'd created. So I said, okay, I think this is something I could do. I love Tailwind CSS. There is quite a good amount of videos around this, but there's no one who's dedicatedly creating videos on Tailwind. So I started doing that, and somehow ended up creating 25 videos on YouTube on Tailwind CSS itself. Yeah, and looks like my channel has the highest that way, apart from Tailwind Labs, of course. So yeah, that's how I discovered Tailwind and started creating content.
So it gave you, and you said like between your 3rd and 4th project, it gave you an actual tailwind, which, like a push from behind, right, because it's so fast. I love that. And, this has also been my experience. But you said something really interesting in the beginning, which is you were good at CSS before, and then you found Tailwind, and Tailwind made you faster. I wonder if you can comment a little bit on this, because nowadays, Tailwind is sort of the preferred, like if you start a Next.js project, for example, it will ask you if you want to use Tailwind. And if you say yes, then a lot of people can create applications these days without ever touching CSS. How do you feel about that, since you were good at CSS, and then you found Tailwind and it enhanced your CSS. Should Tailwind replace CSS?
Tailwind honestly is CSS, so you cannot skip that foundation, because I have seen some people. I had this. I took up this training contract where I trained 3 to 4 employees who were using Tailwind in their project, and they were not very good at CSS and not very good at Tailwind, obviously. And then they were actually picking up a project that was developed by some other developer who used Tailwind, and then that person left. So these people were trying to figure out and, make something work. So I got into call with them and I said, please share your screen and please share your code. I want to see. And then I saw all sorts of classes thrown in there, absolute, flex, and relative, everything. I said, okay, this is not making sense at all. So that is one issue that happens. If you don't know CSS, you'll just try. It's very easy to add classes, right? It's very quick. So, they just end up adding classes and try to position it in the place where they want to see it. And once it works, don't touch the code, right? So they don't try and clean it up. So that is definitely not recommended. You should know the basics. You should know the basics of display property. You don't use the word display flex. Yes, you can simply use flex, but you should know what it does. That's something I definitely recommend. Learn your basics of CSS before jumping into Tailwind.
This is so good. And now that you mention it like that, I'm actually realizing, because I often thought about this, like, can you write Tailwind without knowing CSS? But in listening to you, I've identified and realized that the class names in Tailwind are basically the same words you would use in CSS, like overflow, none, right? Like that's literally a class,
exactly.
overflow dash none. Or flex, or even the positioning classes like justify left and place center. And like, if you don't know CSS, this is not going to make any sense to you.
Exactly. Yes. You may be skipping a couple of words. You're saving 2-3 words, but you're still writing the same.
Yeah. I'd like to talk about Tailwind in terms of the fundamentals. Let's start there. And by the way, I appreciate you like sharing how you got into Tailwind, because, and again, for anyone listening, it's super important and helpful to actually know CSS, be good at CSS, find the pain points with CSS, right? And then move to Tailwind, or maybe not move to Tailwind, but adopt Tailwind. Because Tailwind, I love how you said it, Shruti. Tailwind is CSS.
It's
in the name, Tailwind CSS. So what are some pain points then with CSS that Tailwind CSS can solve?
Oh, there are so many. So first one is the context switching, right? You're fully into the flow. You're writing the HTML, and I'm somebody who doesn't write all the HTML and then go to the style sheet and start styling it. I do it like I add one paragraph, I style it, I add a span tag, maybe style it, I add a link, I add a button. So for me, it goes hand in hand. So for someone like me, I can't keep switching and then, okay, what do I name this again? I already have a card large, or,
Right.
I already have a profile image, but this is a different profile image. So what do I call it? And you lose a few seconds there and you've forgotten what you were doing. So 2 things, context switching and naming. Both are avoided. Those are like the major 2 points that I would want. And then there are some things like cross-browser compatibility. So there are a few things where you need to add these, mods and, things like that, which it probably works in your browser. So you wouldn't add it and you just move on, right? You don't probably test it in different browsers. So when you test, it's probably too late and you don't know why something is not working. For some of the properties that need these, Tailwind adds them automatically. So you can simply add that utility class and Tailwind takes care of the cross-browser compatibility for it. And then...
That's so cool.
Yeah. What are the pain points? Those are the main ones. And of course, some Tailwind properties and values get too verbose and it's difficult to remember them. You have to go into the documentation and search what it is. So for example, like this, justify center, or just place content center. It's quite huge. And then you don't know which property that is, things like that. But with Tailwind and with the auto completion, that there are these IntelliSense tools that are available. You just start typing and which class applies. So these are some pain
Yeah.
points. Another one which I
Awesome.
really loved. Should I? Sure, yeah.
Of course, this is, yeah.
Yeah, one last thing I just remembered now is everybody starts with a normalize CSS or a reset.css, right? And you don't have to do that in Tailwind because it's included in the pre-flight. Even if I'm not using Tailwind classes, I'm tempted to just take that pre-flight and add it. If I have to show a demo in regular CSS sometimes, I just wish there was a way to normalize it in all the browsers. Yeah, that's another thing.
That's so cool. So just the reset alone, you'd say, is worth the value. And I agree. It's kind of sad that user agents, aka browsers, just ship a bunch of assumptions that they think looks good, which often it doesn't, right? Like the user agent margin, I really have a hard time with this. Like, who put that? Why is that there? And I get it, legacy reasons, but if you're building a modern browser for the modern web, why enforce those opinions, okay, so there's the reset you mentioned. It helps not just you, it helps all the developers with context switching, that is stepping between sort of document structure with HTML and styles. It puts them all in one place with class names, and naming, and with naming, man, I remember so much pain with, especially in teams, around like, how do we name things? Do we use BEM? You remember BEM?
Yes.
Block element modifier, gosh. And there was all of these discussions, and honestly, like, the conventions around coming up with class names often cost teams that I've worked on before Tailwind like weeks, because it just, like, it's something you want to quote unquote get right, and then you want it to be, again, quote unquote future proof. There's all these startup terms, but now that Tailwind exists, I hear you, and I think that's so cool that the discussion is just gone, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Straight up, you're saving so many weeks. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to ask you about two things in Tailwind that, I love the horn. There was a car horn. It's so cool. Anyway, I want to ask you about two things in Tailwind that people criticize. One is the length of class names. I've seen some people go absolutely bananas, and the class name with word wrap, the string of class names, like, occupies the entire screen. You've seen the screenshots, right?
Yeah.
With people like cursing Tailwind. Is that actually representative of like work that people do, or is this just created to cause drama?
No, some elements, by some I mean literally probably 2 elements in your entire project might actually need those many class names. Yes, it does have. It's not just added for the sake of, some people still do that. But yes, there are some cases when you need to add those many with word wrap. Yeah, it might go up to 3 to 4 lines. But that's very, very, very rare. Like, so rare that it's a component in itself, or probably you never use it again. It's in one place in your entire project. You just put that in a different file. Don't look at it again. You don't have to look at it again, right? That's the thing. That's the debate that always happens. Like, oh my God, this HTML is not readable. It doesn't have to be readable because there's a very rare chance that you'll actually look at it again. And if you want to edit that, in regular CSS, that would be even longer. That class name if you add all those properties in regular CSS, that's so long. Now imagine scanning your CSS file. It's the same thing, right? Imagine having to search, go to the class name and go there, and your CSS starts bloating so much that I have wasted hours and hours trying to find that exact element that I've styled. I remember the property that I added. I don't remember what I called it or something like that. And then, you end up searching which additional class that I added, which is overriding, my style. And it solves that problem. And so if it's not readable, there are plugins for it. You can use inline fold plugin. And it just puts 3 dots. It just puts an ellipsis in the place of the class name. Yeah, a lot of people don't know this. Only when you hover over it, that appears. So use that if it's bothering you so much.
We'll put links to that in the show notes. I think that's
Yeah.
so. I didn't see again, Shruti. Like I talked to you, it's been like 15 minutes. I already learned something. That's so cool. I'm so happy you're doing this. So the what is it, inline fold plugin, right?
Yeah.
That can solve it. What I heard also from your explanation there is a trade off. The trade-off is between, okay, do you want a really long class name that you maybe don't have to look at much, or do you want to like wrestle with the cascade? Because in CSS you have you said like, oh, what class is overriding what? But if you're using Tailwind, even if your class name is extremely long, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines, but you're using the VS Code extension, perhaps, then any like rules that fight with each other. For example, flex, grid, block. Like if you have these 3 classes, it will give you a yellow underline. It's like actually these cancel each other out. So okay, so I think that's a strong argument, right? You don't have to worry about the cascade. And yes, it gets long, but it sounds like the trade-off is worth it because in terms of like mental load, it's not. It's much easier than navigating the cascade. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I agree with that. And adding to it, the people who see it for the first time, like if I hadn't got to my third project, like I said, it's when I was, going from my third to fourth is when I started getting used to it. If I had seen this long a class name at that point, I would have had second thoughts. Oh my God, if this is how my project is going to get, do I really, do I want to go ahead? But now my brain automatically ignores those. It doesn't
Right.
bother you much after you get used to it. So
Yeah. And I will say also with the class names, the VS Code extension does this really cool thing when you reference a color, it shows you just a little square of what this color looks like. So you make sure you use like there's just so many, and it sure does that with CSS also. But like in CSS, I've always been bothered by the one rule per line, and you just don't have that with class names. So awesome. Thank you for that. Another thing that people often express pain about with Tailwind is, there may be new CSS rules that appear in the spec. Something like the try directive, at try for popover. You can do this now. You can say like try to put it on the left, and if it doesn't work, then put it on the right. It's almost like try catch. And I don't know, Tailwind probably has support for this, but the case where CSS has moved forward, but Tailwind has not yet. How can one make use of like the latest CSS if Tailwind doesn't yet support it?
simply use regular CSS. You anyway have a style sheet where you're adding the CSS directives of Tailwind, right? And you surely have 1 or 2 other classes also, because there would be third-party libraries where you cannot style them, but you have them. And for those, the only way to style them is to use regular CSS. Or, yeah, of course, you can use the apply directive and things like that. You can still use Tailwind within the style sheet. But in this case, just nobody's stopping you from mixing Tailwind with regular CSS. So, yeah, of course, don't do that so much that that your developer wouldn't know whether to look in the structure, the HTML or the CSS. But when you really have no way to do it in Tailwind, just simply use regular CSS. That's it.
I'm thrilled to announce that the Contagious Code podcast is now sponsored by Wix Studio. Digital marketers, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less when you manage projects on Wix Studio. You can work in sync with your team on one canvas. You can reuse templates, widgets, and sections across your sites. You can create a client kit for seamless handovers. And you can leverage best-in-class SEO defaults across all your Wix sites. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio to see more. There's a link in the show notes. Fantastic. You mentioned the apply directive. This is another thing. Developers on teams that I've worked with for the past, 2 or 3 years, there's always been a discussion around this. Should we use apply? Why in pull request reviews? Why does this not use apply? Why are you writing display flex here? And sometimes people get very religious about it. Can we lay down some guidelines for the use of apply? That is, should we use it as often as we can? Should we maybe not use it? Like, what's the best practice with apply?
Okay, the official documentation itself says don't use apply too much. right? So
Right.
that's because you're once again doing the same thing. You are not eliminating the pain point because you're naming a class and then you're taking it into the style sheet and you're simply using apply there. Of course, you're reducing a few characters. You're not writing regular CSS there with the properties and values, but you are still naming the class and you are still putting it in a different place where you have to go and look it up. And once again, if you're overriding that with the utility class, it will work. But then again, you're overriding it in HTML that time. It's not the style. So as much as possible, or just to make your HTML beautiful or readable, don't use apply. If there is no other way, like I mentioned, the third-party packages, there is no other way you can style them using Tailwind. You have to use those class names. Then definitely use apply, because there you don't have to write regular CSS. You can use the Tailwind classes with apply. So as much as possible, avoid. That's what even Adam Watson says. So don't use it just to beautify HTML. That's the thing.
Right. It's supposed to be an exception, a fallback to where you absolutely need your own class, it sounds like. Let's talk a little bit about the Tailwind config. So for those who aren't aware, Tailwind is it gives you the ability to have this Tailwind config.js file that you export a JavaScript object and it extends Tailwind's functionality, or it replaces Tailwind's functionality. And you can add like color palettes and themes. So my biggest use of the Tailwind config has been for animations. I just add animations that do various things and it becomes accessible as a class name. Can you use the Tailwind config, for example, to basically to do the same thing in regular CSS, right? To add support for newer CSS rules? Or is that not the best way? Is it better to just like write CSS in a file?
No, you definitely can. You can create your own plugins, which means you can create your own class names, both static and dynamic. Just recently, I even spoke about this at Laracon Europe, where I just created a class name like, what is that? Avatar. So, let's say you need an avatar class. It might be available in different frameworks, but since Tailwind is utility first, you will have to use like, let's say, rounded full, shadow SM, border 4 and border maybe orange 300, whatever. So those 5 to 6 class names you will repeat everywhere. The only thing that might change is the size, right? In your nav bar, you might want an avatar SM, something like that. Like it would be nice to have avatar SM there, and then probably you have a profile card where you need an avatar XL. You can create those on your own using the config. You can create your own plugins. You add all those classes that are actually static, like the rounded full and then the border and things like that, and just say that I want to change the width and the height. For SM, you want a particular size. For MD, you want a particular size. And those class names will be exactly available to you, even with the auto-completion, just like they were from Tailwind. Make use of them.
I'm about to ask.
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
It has its pros and cons. You have to do it in the right way. Don't do that for everything. Depends on your project needs. And some, like, I don't know about the try block. I'm not sure if that's possible. Some are not possible to literally do it in the HTML. Some have to be done in the style sheet. But if it can be done in HTML, you can create your own plugins. You can add them in the config file and totally use them.
Yeah. I think that's so cool. I'm about to ask a very silly question now that you mentioned plugins. And that is there a sort of, like in Apple, you have the App Store? And Google, you have the Play Store. Is there like a plugin store for Tailwind where I can just go like discover a bunch of plugins and filter and find the right one? Is this a GitHub repository? Does that exist? Because like I have to imagine it's probably easier to go find an avatar plugin than make my own.
Yeah, unfortunately, there is no Tailwind plugin repository, but that's giving me ideas.
Well, that's why we have the podcast. That's so cool. Yeah. And then it could be like a website and you can do like vector search and you can like find plugins based on what the feeling they want as opposed to the keywords. So cool. I would support that. In fact, if you want to collaborate on it, I think that'd be super helpful.
Yeah.
Awesome. I think, yeah, this is, can developers write or from the Tailwind configuration file declare things with at rules? And by this I mean keyframes, for example, or media, right? At media or supports. Is that, can you sort of express that through the Tailwind config format, or is this you have to write like traditional CSS only?
Keyframes are possible, but why it feels like it's a CSS thing. Why would you do that in JSS? Right? I mean,
Yeah.
so that's one thing. That's another thing. Adam Wathan himself said that, there are certain things you can do in both CSS and JS, and the developers feel it's natural in CSS, but it doesn't feel the same in JS. You don't have to fight it. Not everything has to be in the config. It can be in your style sheet, like keyframes especially. It makes sense to have them in the style sheet. So there are certain things which have to be, I mean, you can have rules in your team saying that, no, these things will go in style sheet. But the best part is the version 4. I don't know when it's releasing. I'm hoping that it's this month or the next. In the version 4, the alpha is already out and you can test it. Most of the configuration is shifting to the style sheet and not the JS file.
What?
So you can define
really?
all your tokens, yes, all your design tokens, like your colors, you customize them, right? You can put all of them in CSS and it looks so clean, so much like where it belongs. And just like variables, right? Your custom properties, you put them all in the style sheet. So that's possible in Tailwind.
So is tailwind.config.js going away?
Maybe not. Even the team doesn't know yet, because for plugins, you do need them. You can't do that in CSS. There are certain things like custom content, and even content auto discovery is coming to Tailwind v4. So remember, the first thing you need to do when you install Tailwind is you have to go to your config.js and change that content key.
Yeah.
You have to put where all to find your Tailwind classes. Like you find them in my JS files and in HTML and things like that. But that's going to change. You might not have to do that. Yeah, you might not even need the config file, because Tailwind in version 4 will auto discover. But for some reason, if you still want to say it's not discovering, or if you want to say that look in this file particularly, the only way to do that is then include the config file and do it.
That's
exciting.
Do we know the details about how this auto discovery works? Like, if I have to guess, it's probably like a match on like star dot TSX, JSX, HTML, CSS, whatever, and you ignore node modules because that's the default one, right? So is that just like an implicit rule in the framework itself, and then you can fine tune it if you need?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
I've seen that the team has worked very hard on trying to pattern match and saying that nobody will name, it's their own classes, right? So then they're thinking, what if somebody creates a name like this and then that cannot be found, and things like that. So they've tried to put in a lot of work in this area. Yeah, it is pattern matching, yes.
This is one of those moments where I'm like speechless and also like marveling at innovation, right? Because like I've been using Tailwind for years, you've been using Tailwind for years, and honestly, I've settled into like a comfort zone. I'm like, okay, this is Tailwind. I use it every day. I know how to set it up and so on. And this like the content key in the configuration, I've written it a million times. And the thing is though, I do it initially and then literally forget about it. It's set it and forget it. So I never ever thought, hey, you know what? It would be cool if like we just turn this into auto discovery, because but now that you mention it, that's such a cool thing. It's so cool how the team just innovates against these like small friction points to make it even better. Wow, that's so cool. I have so much respect for that. So there's auto discovery, which I feel like now that the config file may be going away or maybe partially used in CSS, I would be very interested to follow that, I don't know, GitHub discussion or issue or something, because I feel like if done improperly, and I don't think it will be done improperly, of course, but like if I was to do this and make mistakes, a big mistake would result in, you've got a config.js, you've got a config CSS. They're sort of 50-50, kind of like apply, where you're still defining class names, but you're like having half your configuration in JavaScript, half your configuration in CSS may seem like somewhat difficult. So I would be so interested to see how they sort of consolidate. Should they consolidate? It sounds like a really interesting discussion.
Yes.
Where can people follow the discussion, and where is it at the latest state?
It is on GitHub. The discussions of Tailwind CSS repository. A lot of discussions are happening, and you can even see the issues, tagged v4. So the ones that are specific to version 4, and maybe you can see people who are really into that. They can see how they can contribute, or at least see what's going on, or there is even that blog post which says open sourcing our progress on Tailwind v4. So where they've specified clearly that what are the things even they are undecided about, or even they are thinking what's the best way to go about, and certain things that they already know that this is what is coming. There is also that play CDN link, not play CDN, the play.tailwindcss.com, the playground, where you can see even that has the alpha version already. So you can try out the new configuration in CSS and see how that feels.
That's so cool. Well, thank you. We'll put links to all of that in the show notes as well. Thank you so much. You mentioned when you started with Tailwind, there was all this stuff about post CSS, and you didn't even know what post CSS was at the time. I mean, you've learned since. For the listeners, could you briefly talk about post CSS and its role in sort of the Tailwind ecosystem?
Yeah. So Tailwind CSS is something that you write, and then Tailwind generates the actual real regular style sheet for you. So the browser isn't doing anything different. It's still able to read the regular CSS itself. So that post CSS is what is done to just before compiling that CSS part. That's how I've understood it. Honestly, I still don't use it anywhere else. It's only because of Tailwind that I know what post CSS is. So it just, you use that to make sure that your Tailwind classes become, regular CSS. That is, Tailwind CSS uses it. You don't even have to do that. So earlier, I think we had to go into post CSS config and then mention Tailwind CSS there or something like that. That's again a very old version, but now it just uses behind the scenes. And again, v4 might not even use it. So they have this whole, complete engine called Oxide. They've developed it, and they're using Lightning CSS behind the scenes, something like that. So they might not be the post CSS. You don't have to install post CSS anymore.
What is Lightning CSS?
That's another open source framework, tooling, something related to that. Yeah, not aware.
So interesting. When I was taught post CSS, they told me it was a CSS post processor. So kind of like how Babel will take JavaScript, new JavaScript turned into. It was called 6 to 5, ES6 to ES5. Just change. So I think it adds the browser prefixes and so on. But there was also a plugin that you had to use back in the day, and this is obviously, thank God, has been fixed or improved upon. You would have to use a post CSS plugin called Purge CSS to do something. And also, a big criticism that I've heard from Tailwind haters, which I think they're all wrong, but whatever, let's be objective about it, is that Tailwind generates one class name per rule. Right, so like flex is only display flex. There's nothing more in that declaration. Grid is display grid, and so on and so forth. So it's like one class name. So some people who maybe aren't as familiar with the concept of atomic CSS or Tailwind or utility classes, they criticize Tailwind, saying that's a massive CSS file. It's megabyte. How can you ship megabytes of CSS to your users? What's an appropriate response to that?
The response to that is the larger projects that you're using, right? Now you're literally using Flex on all your elements. Okay, so let's say you have 100 elements, where you're using Flex, which is not huge. 100 is because these days, we use Flex for everything. Back in those days, I don't know how we worked without it, but now that it's available, even for vertical elements, we use Flex call, for icons, for everything. So let's say for 100 elements, you're using the class Flex, okay? And that rule is in style sheet, it is generated only once. Okay, but let's say you have 100 elements. In your style sheet, you have 100 elements and there's that display flex rule 100 times. So how do you say that, that is okay and this is not? So eventually, if you look at the entire project and you look at the style sheet, it kind of evens out, and most huge projects also have CSS files which are less than 10 KB. That's because, of this. This is the way I explained. I don't know how to explain it better than that, but it's not how you think it will happen. Like, even if it's one rule, you're using that rule in multiple places. So you're eventually reducing the style sheet itself, not increasing it.
I love this because it makes the case for Tailwind CSS to be also, like, outside of just convenience. We already talked about, for example, context switching and naming and the base reset styles. Outside of these developer conveniences, there's also end user conveniences because it, in theory, or actually not in theory, in practice, ships less code than traditional CSS because of what you mentioned. Because typically in an application, if you have 100 different classes that have a rule display flex, then you ship that line display flex 100 times more than you need to. Whereas with Tailwind CSS and utility classes, that rule display flex is shipped once. That's like a 100x improvement in how much code you ship.
Not exactly. You're still writing flex in HTML, but still, yeah.
Right.
Somewhat,
Yeah. Right. Fair. Yeah, you're right. So it's 4 bytes for every how many ever display flex. Yeah, good. Thank you for correcting that. There's also this thing that Tailwind used to do where it would, as part of the post CSS process, it would read your source code and look at the class names you're using, and then from that big final generated CSS file, it would just remove classes you're not using as a build optimization. Is that still the case? How does that impact performance? I mean, obviously positively, probably, right? Because it removes a bunch of unused stuff.
So that was back in version 2 point something. Tailwind CSS had these, tens of thousands of class names, fixed class names, like every single class name that you see in the documentation. All of this was there. So in your development, you would take that entire thing and just use the ones that you need. And you had to actually purge them for production. So your production style sheet would be different from your development one, right? And that was back then. Then came the just-in-time compiler. So what just-in-time does is it doesn't give you that entire style sheet when you develop. The only styles it generates are the one that are there in your source code from the beginning, in development itself. So your development style sheet is same as the one as production. And then this just-in-time compiler became the default from version 3 onwards. So people who are using Tailwind version 3 onwards don't even know what this purge thing is. So if they come across this, they don't need to. If they come across this in blog posts or videos, they might really wonder, oh, do I have to do this? That means, because they see the discussion, right? And the discussion is like, Tailwind, if you don't purge, you get like this huge style sheet. And they probably are still under that impression. But no, Tailwind generates only those styles that are there from the beginning. Yeah.
This is so cool. I think there's a big engineering optimization performance idea here that a lot of developers can extract and take away. This is and I want everybody to sort of listen to this, right? And you can tell me, Shruti, if this is appropriate or accurate. But what I'm hearing is, so in version 2, Tailwind did this thing where they generate a bunch of CSS, step 1, like a big CSS file, and then read the source code, the classes you use, and then basically remove the classes that are not used from this big CSS. That was version 2.
It's called tree shaking.
And then with the just-in-time compiler in version 3, Right, exactly. And in version 3, what they do with this JIT or just-in-time compiler is instead of that flow, they start with not generating a big bundle, but they start with reading your code. Because they're going to read your code anyway, and in version 2, they were doing it after. But now if you do it first, you can look at all the class names and then only generate the class names that are used. So it's not removing anything, it's actually an additive process. Is that accurate?
Yes,
That
that's
is so
accurate.
cool.
And if I may add something here, that gave them
Of
the
course.
so in version 2, what if you needed these extra colors, like the default was gray, and then there was red, and there was orange, and all of those. But now you can use all the colors like slate and stone, amber, fuchsia, all of these by default. You don't have to add them in your config. Earlier, you had to add them in your config, all these, to use all these new colors. Because, I mean, imagine shipping that huge a bundle, right? I mean, you can't download, I mean, you can't put that entire thing in development. It'll slow down your development, right? So now, because of this JIT thing, they are able to give us a lot more utility classes without the developer having to even know that, they have to add them or something like this.
That's so cool. There should be a class like Amber, but Ambur, and it's just the color of biryani. Oh my gosh, that would be so cool. I think another consequence of this JIT that we're talking about is the ability to do something like text dash square brackets hex code, right? And that's because it's just in time. It can literally just generate that on the fly.
Yes,
That
exactly.
is so cool. Amazing. It's just the innovation blows my mind. To go from tree shaking to look, we're going to read the source code anyway. So instead of reading the source code after generating, you just read the source code before. Man, that's just it blows my mind how cool that was. And again, I hope this is open and that discussion will be fun to even follow after the fact. Like we've had it for I think years now, but to see how it's done, right? And I think that's the beauty of open source.
Open
so
source.
Cool. So in code, you can still so for example, JavaScript is super optimized. Like the engines are they're optimized to the point where it's very difficult oftentimes to like de-opt yourself in JavaScript, meaning to do something that's going to make the engine do more work than necessary and be slower. But people still do it. Also in React, for example, they try to make it easy to make performant applications, but sometimes in an effort to optimize your code, you end up de-optimizing your code, meaning you'll cause like unnecessary memory allocation. In the case of imports, sometimes you can import modules in a way that doesn't allow tree shaking, so you like de-opt yourself, you de-optimize. In Tailwind, with the JIT, with all of this, are there still ways that developers should know about that they may be de-optimizing their code? And if yes, what can they do to help that?
Maybe not de-optimizing, but one thing they need to know is their class names will not be discovered if they are broken. For example, let's say you add a BG somewhere in your, let's say you have a React component or something, and then you're saying that, class name is BG hyphen, and then if this is success, then green 500, or, else, let's say red 500. Something like that. So those classes are broken there in the code, in the source code, right? Tailwind will not be able to discover them. They have to be completely BG green 500, BG red 500, because Tailwind does that pattern matching. So for Tailwind, green 500 is not a class name. BG green 500 is. So if you're going to have your class names like conditional classes or something, or wherever else, you can totally have them in your JS files, but they have to be full. They have to be the entire class name. Don't split them anywhere. Probably that's the only thing they need to know. Yeah, there's no way you can, maybe de-optimize. I don't think there's a way. Yeah.
Yeah. By broken, you mean broken by space. So they have to be like one consistent string. Right.
Yeah, not just space, like in different lines, like, you put a variable like class equals BG, and then you append green 500 and you append something. So in the, Tailwind scans the file and it can't find the entire class name. So then it won't be available.
That's super.
Yeah.
So I've run into some cases, and there may be no solution for this at the time. So that's totally acceptable. I've run into cases where, for example, the JIT cannot see things. So, for example, this actually is really painful because like it works locally because Tailwind is the post-processing pipeline locally on my dev server, but when I deploy it doesn't. And what I'm talking about is like lazy loaded components. So like when I say I have a dropdown and I click the dropdown and I trigger a popover, but this popover is only loaded when I click the dropdown. And the popover contains HTML with some class names. So on a local development server, when the popover opens, if I hit save or something, then I recompute the style sheet. Tailwind does the thing. It generates some style sheets. I get it. But when I deploy this to the cloud, that dev server refresh doesn't happen. And that popover never triggers the JIT for Tailwind to then create the styles. And then I end up with like a big unstyled popover in production. Have you experienced this? Have people experienced this? What's the best practice to fix this?
Yeah, there is a solution, and that is you can add the class, since you already know what classes those are, you can add all those classes in, I forgot, it's not safe list, it's something else. I haven't used it recently, so I don't remember, but definitely you can pre-add them. Like you can say that you might not be able to find these styles in any of my files, but I need these classes. You can put them in the config. .js. So those utility classes are included by default, whether you have them in your files or not. So then it'll work.
That's so cool.
I will get back to you on what that key is. Yeah, in the config file.
A lot of folks talk about the safe list as being like file paths, but I didn't realize you could just do it for class names. That really solves everything.
Yeah, it's not the safe list. It's something else. I'm just confusing. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. What are some problems you've experienced? It sounds like you've done some consulting, right? What are some problems you've seen with very large scale? I'm talking like enterprise, like big Tailwind projects that maybe the average developer may not be exposed to. And of course, how do you solve them?
Yeah, one thing is not using enough components. So then people end up reusing the styles. They don't make sure to extract components. And then they end up with very large, unreadable HTML, right? And at that point, it's even possible to end up with inconsistent styling because, you have a link in many places or a button or anything. And since you don't have class names now, you can add your own class names. The developer ends up adding a different shade of gray maybe, or a different color, something like that. And also another thing is if you don't want your developers to accidentally use a particular color, which is already there in Tailwind, you must make sure to, override the existing theme and include only the colors that you actually need. Or it's not just colors, even the shadows or, the rounded corners and those things. Tailwind is opinionated. It thinks that, the shadows have to be like that. And it's very easy for, people developing maybe not user-facing modules, maybe admin dashboards or something. It's very easy to simply add a shadow. But if that's not what your design system has, or if that's not how other pages are, things like that, you should add your own stuff to the config and then disable the defaults, basically override them so that there are no inconsistencies, and extract smaller components, again, for consistency and readability and so much more.
Excellent. You mentioned, you bring up a really good point about this, specifically your use of the word consistency and inconsistency, because up until the JIT phase or the just-in-time compiler, I feel like things were more consistent. I've worked with some teams, very large projects, and because of the just-in-time compiler, I see a lot more square brackets and a lot more like outside of config color palette colors, a lot more custom shadows, a lot more. And I feel like this is really abusing the JIT, right? Yeah. Because you're also then at that point just generating like custom CSS per component. What are some ways, first of all, have you experienced this? And second of all, what's the best practice to not do that? Is there a way to, for example, say, you know what, the JIT is just not allowed anymore for this reason or something like that?
Okay, it's just like giving a knife, right? You probably gave the knife to chop the vegetables, but they ended up stabbing themselves. So, it's like you're giving the power, but there's nothing you can do about it. You can't say, make the knife blunt when it's pointed towards yourself or something like that. It's something that the companies will have to enforce rules, and you're going to use JIT only when it's a one-off thing, literally a one-off thing. If you're using it even twice somewhere, if you're using the same thing the second time, probably you might really want to put it in your style sheet or your config, mainly your config.
Interesting.
Yeah, it should be a one-off thing. So, then it's okay to use it. It's totally okay to use those colors, because let's say you have this Twitter icon just once, or X, yeah, whatever. Okay, sorry, I'll use LinkedIn as the example maybe. This LinkedIn color, you don't have to have that in your config. It doesn't make sense, right? But that icon has to have that color. So then totally use the JIT, use the arbitrary values.
I have an idea now for Tailwind, and this may be my open source contribution. It may be a listener's open source contribution. It may actually be done already and no one's contribution other than the core team. But I had this idea listening to you. Since the JIT reads every class name, right? It could detect duplicate custom class names, literally like duplicates within the square brackets. Be like, hey, this hex code is like appearing more than once, maybe, and then give you like a warning in the console, like maybe consider putting this in Tailwind config. Ooh, does that exist? Is this something I could do or some listener could do?
Yeah, I'm not aware of such a tool. I mean, it's not existing anywhere. So yeah, you can. Warning, this arbitrary values has been used more than 5 times. That's great.
Yeah, and then you can even, like, in the Tailwind config, be like, like TypeScript gives you like strictness. You could be like, after how many occurrences of the same arbitrary value do you want a warning? And then you can even turn it off. Wow. This is why I love open source. I'm literally like, if I get some time off, I'm going to go I'm going to propose the change and we'll see how it goes. Thank you. That's so cool. Wow. Okay. I'd love to keep this going. It's such a this is honestly the greatest discussion about Tailwind I've ever had in my life. That's just so fun. What's your favorite class name?
I think it has to be BG Indigo 500. I just like that Indigo 500 color, so probably I use that for all my buttons if I'm just creating a initial mock-up or something like that. Yeah.
So cool. My favorite is, you didn't ask, but whatever.
Oh, sorry.
My favorite is it's fine. My favorite is backdrop blur. And I love that they give you like different sizes for this: backdrop blur LG, backdrop blur SM. So cool, and it really helps make this like iOS. You're using an iPhone currently. They have this cool blur thing on iOS. They make that so easy to emulate. Yeah, I really love that.
Yeah, okay, class morphism.
I want to. I want to talk to you a little bit about responsive stuff in Tailwind, because again, we talked about the pain points, and indeed, context switching, resets, and naming absolutely the pillars that it fixes. Also, the user experience of performance. One thing that I've wanted my entire life that Tailwind gave me, right, is the ability to have the convenience of using a style attribute in HTML, but also do responsive. And you can't do that. You can't do like style is something, because style is still a string in HTML. So you can't do like @media, min width, whatever. Tailwind, of course, brings with it some responsive features, obviously for like viewport size. But what are some responsive features you can do with Tailwind that are maybe unexpected to developers? I'm thinking of things like dark mode or motion sensitivity, things that unfortunately are super important for accessibility, but that are often overlooked by development teams because they have to quote unquote move fast.
It's not with respect to Tailwind alone. I feel that it's not just limited to Tailwind. Even with regular CSS or anything else, a lot of people don't use semantic HTML for one thing. Just put div everywhere. I think a lot of people are getting aware these days, thanks to accessibility experts, and you think for a second at least before adding a div. Should this be a div? shouldn't it be a button or shouldn't it be a link? And even the difference between links and buttons, and then navigation, and then lists. There's so much. So semantic HTML is so important. And again, it's not related to Tailwind, but yeah, you should be considering that. And area attributes. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. Area. I'm not sure. Yeah. Those are important as well. But one thing I read somewhere, again, not related to Tailwind, is if you don't know what attributes to add, at least don't add the wrong ones. It's better to leave them out than, you're doing more harm. You're not trying to help them. So those are some things I really like to point out. Dark mode, it's, one more thing. Yes, the animation. Because it's so easy to add animation with Tailwind, you should not add it everywhere. We should make sure that you add it with, making sure that it's not a way, it doesn't pop up for those who have disabled motion, who have this motion, a little bit of the sickness. So use those, think about them before just simply adding animations everywhere, transitions or things like that.
Is there a conditional, like a modifier? I don't know what these are called in Tailwind. When you have like hover : something, and with dark mode, you can say dark : something. Yes. Is there, and this is me showing my ignorance, I haven't really implemented this. Is there something like reduced motion, like a modifier for reduced motion?
Yes, it's called motion safe, motion-safe. Yeah, just like you said, dark and light. Yeah, motion-safe, and then put whatever, animate, spin or something like that, and that shows up only for people who have turned off that reduce motion, whatever that is setting. Yeah.
There's also probably one for print as well, right? Just to print. What are these things called? The thing that precedes the colon. A modifier. Okay, good. I'm glad I that was actually my guess. But then I thought, wait, this is too close to BEM. And then it started to bring up my BEM trauma. But that's cool. So Tailwind has a very strong integration story with things like React, Vue, Angular, Astro. Do you feel like that has helped its adoption? I have to assume, because like, for example, in the React space, a huge topic for a long time was, do you go with CSS and JS, or do you quote unquote use the platform, right? With Tailwind, it is indeed purely CSS. It's just-in-time compiled CSS, but also it just finds a natural fit with React, Vue, Angular, etc. So I guess the question is, how does it fit into that space, specifically the space of JS and CSS and JS, and should developers using CSS and JS maybe consider Tailwind as an alternative? And if yes, why? And if no, why not?
No, there is no should here. It's still, Tailwind CSS is still for convenience. It's not something that will automatically improve, like you said, accessibility or performance. No, it's not that. It's purely, or it's more of developer experience itself still. So it completely is still a choice of should you use it or should you not. Yes, I see a lot of people saying, you shouldn't use this. This is wrong, or this is not how it should be. Those purists, I don't think it makes sense to force somebody not to use it. If it's going to help you in your experience, if it's going to make it fast, then definitely do it. But then again, there are certain pros and cons, which I'm sure a lot of people are aware already. Overriding something, and there are some disadvantages of CSS and JS, which Tailwind helps. There are some disadvantages in Tailwind that probably this helps. So once again, it just boils down to convenience more than forcing something.
That's so good. I wish more people talked like this on Twitter, because usually on X, usually it's like, hey, you should only be using, for example, everything should be React server components. If it's not server components, you're doing React wrong. That's sort of the discourse. And I don't know, I question how helpful that stuff is. While we're on the subject of sort of, I don't know, like advanced Tailwind, which I consider like modified, like this motion safe thing, I'd say that's pretty advanced. I wanted to ask you about layers. Is it layer? I remember like at Tailwind, there's this like at something, and scope layer, something like this. I'm really showing my incompetence here, but it's at something, and you can like scope Tailwind rules to you probably know what I'm talking about. Can we like explain some of that? Because for me, this is the edges of my experience.
Yeah, so you were right. It's at layer, and then you either put it in the base layer or the components or the utilities. So base is something like you add styles to your headings and paragraphs, links, maybe because a Tailwind strips out that underline from link, right? Which is browser default underline, and then you add a link and suddenly you expect it to have that underline because we're so used to it and it's not there. But if you want underline everywhere in your Tailwind project, you should add that in the layer base. So you say at layer space base. It's very much like the native layers in CSS now, the new feature. And in that, just say, the anchor tag and add text underline. So this way it appears in your entire project. But let's say you have a link which looks like a button, right? You want to style it like a button where you don't want an underline, right? At that time, you will still be able to override those base styles using utility classes. Or you might even be able to override them in your utilities layer, right? So you might say BTN and for some reason, have this apply, feature, and then you might still have, link, no underline or no underline utility class. If it's put in the utilities layer, and even in the style sheet, if your utilities layer, definition is on top, and then comes your base layer definition, your utilities one will be added later. So which makes sure that it overrides. That's why you use layers. So the order in which you write will not matter as long as you're adding them in the correct layers. It will always be base overridden by components, overridden by utilities. So it's important to add them in layers. Yeah. Otherwise, you will not be able to, use them properly.
So it sounds like it's cascade control. So the best practice, if we extract from this, is you should almost never use apply because you're creating your own class names, and that's sort of against the purpose of Tailwind. But in some cases, you might need to do that. Yeah. If you're using apply and creating class names, it's always good to put them in a layer that speaks to how much precedence it should have. Base means it can be overridden pretty easily. Component means it overrides base, but can still be overridden by utility, and utility is like the god tier of overrides in the cascade. Does that capture the gist of what you said?
Yeah, mostly. And this is not just for apply. Even if you're adding regular CSS, for some reason, if you're adding some regular CSS as well, that has to go in the apply.
Awesome.
You have to
How does this conflict with
one of the layers?
Thank you. How does this conflict with like the native layer syntax in CSS now? Does it conflict? Does it complement?
No, it doesn't conflict. As far as I know, yeah. And I think, so cool. Again, version 4 uses the native layers or something. I haven't gone deep into that.
Fantastic.
I think I should,
I saw a video on your YouTube channel, which I want to talk about your YouTube channel for a little while. This was so cool because I learned that you can now use Tailwind CSS to solve a problem that for me has been a real pain across my entire career, and to this day is still a pain. And the problem I'm speaking about is emails, because everything needs to be a table to support like Outlook and Legacy, although the new version of Outlook uses Chromium, so maybe not. But historically, email rendering, email design, email development, even though it's using HTML, it has always been a pain because things had to be tables and I had to do layout in a very conflicting way. And also, you can't just like reference style sheets across the internet because a lot of email clients will block external URLs, so you have to have all your styles in line and it gets very painful. I saw on your YouTube channel, there's a way that you can, with Tailwind CSS, design and create some really nice emails in a more comfortable way. Can we speak about that for a little while? Because I think I'm not unique here. A lot of people have pain doing emails, and if there's an easier way, I think we should offer it to people.
Yes, you're right. Oh, sorry to break it to you. We still have to use tables. that is not an option. But yeah, here you don't have to link external style sheets because you're already comfortable with Tailwind. It's all in HTML itself. So you don't have to use inline styles, which is the recommended way for emails. Instead of using inline styles, now you can style them with Tailwind using this package called Maisel. That's available for all. It's not specific to any framework. Maisel is framework agnostic. You can even have a separate repository where you create your emails, you export them, and then you add those files. That workflow is still available. You can create it's like the source code, and then it generates that email thing for you with the styles which are recommended, and you can add them. I even heard there's a version 5 now. When I was recording the video, it was 4 dot something. So I haven't checked, but 5 must have some more exciting features. So yes, I've started using Maisel for my emails. I cannot do those inline styles and write those long classes anymore. Yeah.
That's so painful. Maisel, we'll put a link to that in the show notes. Can you do this even in like CRM tools? For example, MailChimp. They have like an in browser email designer and editor. So it's not going to be a code repo that I fully own. What's the process of like adding Maisel? Do I just include a script tag? I can't include a script tag because then the email client will block it, right? How does one add Maisel to an email?
So I think even MailChimp has this way where you can put your custom HTML, right? You don't have to use the builder. So just generate it in Maisel and copy that, put it there. I've seen a lot of people do that.
Oh,
so
cool.
The exported
so
one
Maisel,
from Maisel, yeah, you can just copy that.
Awesome. Okay, so this is just me not knowing what Maisel is. I thought it was something you add to your project, but it seems to be a generator. So it can generate HTML for you.
Yes.
That's fantastic. I can't wait to use this Maisel. So cool. You also, so by the way, I'm now speaking about your YouTube channel because I think it's a great resource. Again, we'll put links to the show in the show notes here to this. But so I learned about Maisel and Tailwind based email from you and from the channel. I also saw that you built a game like with state in CSS. How? Why? Why? Obviously, because you can. But I guess the question is how? How does one get state in CSS to build like rock, paper, scissors?
So that
and can it be done with Tailwind?
That's something I didn't try. Did I not try? I don't recall. It was quite long ago. I came across a repository. So this is not my idea. So I just came across a repository because I was just searching for CSS games. So what could be done with CSS? Like how do I just push my boundaries, right? And then I saw this, maybe it's rock, paper, scissors itself. I don't remember. The UI was quite different. And it was simply using animation and animation delay. So something like that. Honestly, I've forgotten how to do that. If you ask me to develop this game once again, I have to go back to my own video and see how it's done. So you can't add state. It's just a hacky way of doing it. So it just banks upon that transition delay property and something else like checkboxes.
Right. I've seen people do rock, paper, scissors with CSS also. Sorry, not rock, paper, scissors, my bad. I mean tic-tac-toe with CSS, using similar hacks, which I think is cool.
Yeah.
Why not? I probably wouldn't do it in production, but it's reasonable to learn.
Yeah.
Speaking of your YouTube channel, it's called Thyrus. This is THIRUS on YouTube, @Thyrus. That's a cool name. Where does it come from?
It comes from my name, SHRUTI. Just jumble up the letters and some cool name that makes sense. Actually, it doesn't make sense. It just sounds nice. Thyrus sounds nice.
Does.
And it sounded like a dinosaur. So I added a cute dino icon to that. And simply went with it. Sounds like a brand name, right?
That's so cool. Yeah, definitely. It sounds like a great. It's. I feel like there's a lot of people who tend to overthink. So, for example, me, I started a developer relations consultancy in 2023, and you won't believe how much time I spent thinking about the name. What should I
Name,
call it? I
yes.
literally, like, I spoke to all my friends, and I was like, "What about this? What about this? What about Devrel Lee, Devrel.io, Devrel Rocks, Devrel?" And like at some point, I realized this doesn't matter. I could call it Sajet, my name backwards, which I like that you just sort of went with it. I think that's very cool, and I think that's a takeaway for everybody listening. Just stop overthinking it. Just do it. Um, Fantastic. I wanted to ask you about just terminology. Listeners, myself, we sometimes struggle with the right terms for things. In Tailwind, you have components that can be considered static and dynamic. What is a dynamic component in Tailwind?
So like I said, this avatar component that you could create.
Yeah.
So there are static and dynamic utilities, right? I think that is pretty easy to understand because BG, some color, let's say, that is a dynamic utility because the property is the same, background color, but it's the value that you're changing. That's a dynamic utility class. You can add BG
Got
and you
it.
can add your own arbitrary value, right? Hex code, something, whatever, BB, CC, whatever. So those are
Right.
dynamic utility classes. But let's say something like flex. That's a static utility class. There is no, flex something
Because it
else.
represents the value of the display
Yeah,
property.
exactly. Yeah. So, and similar to that, there are components which Tailwind doesn't really offer many components that way, but you can create your own static and dynamic components. Static ones are simple. You just put them in your CSS file, or you can put them in your, config, Tailwind config itself in the, what do you say, in that plugins part. You can add your own components like I said, profile image, profile card, button, and things like that. If it's static, you can add it in CSS or in JS. But if you want to create a dynamic one, like button large, button small, and things like that, you would go for dynamic utilities where you say BTN, and then whatever you add after that, you can say which property changes there. So it could probably be the size, the width, or the padding, the text size,
Right.
and things like that. Yeah, you need to have a little bit of JS knowledge to be able to create dynamic utilities. But the documentation is all there. It's totally
Awesome.
there, and it's easy
So
to,
good.
yeah, do it.
Fantastic. All right. I think it's time to start wrapping up. And to do so, I want to talk to you about two things. You already mentioned this really awesome plugin called Inline Fold. Inline Fold. I think it's Inline Fold,
Yeah.
if I remember correctly. I want to get two things. One, your excellent list of plugins that boost productivity, specifically in Tailwind, but otherwise also if you have any. I think this is something super useful. For example, a lot of developers, when I do a demo, they see that next to my import statements in JavaScript, it shows you like this is 200 KB, that's 32 KB, and they go like, what is that? And I'm like, it's a plugin called import cost. So I think as developers, we all have these plugins that we love that help us, and so if you'd be willing to share some of those, I think that'd be cool. And then second, I'd like to also get your like sort of the upcoming things in Tailwind that you're excited about, things like the maybe getting rid of the config file or moving stuff to CSS, etc. So let's start with plugins and then go from there.
Yeah,
By plugins, I mean
plugins.
extensions.
Yeah, the plugins or extensions, there aren't too many, but there's one more that I would like to mention in case people are not aware, which is the sorting plugin. So people add Tailwind classes in all sorts of order, right? You can add the padding first, you can add the color later, you can add flex somewhere in between and things like that. And every time a different developer looks at it, they might have a different way of adding it. And it usually like, hey, where is the flex here? Let me add it. And then you see that it's somewhere hidden in between.
Yeah.
So there is this Prettier plugin by Tailwind CSS itself. It's the first party plugin, Prettier Tailwind CSS sorting or something like that, which you can add it to your repository. It's not a VS Code extension. You will have to add that as a package, as a dev dependency, and then use it. Then after you type the classes, they will be automatically sorted. And it's opinionated. So it kind of follows the box model. Like, so if you're adding margin, border, padding, it comes in that order, because margin is the outermost, and then the border, then the padding, then the display properties are added first, and then like something that affects the the size and position are added first, and something that affects the color or some more smaller things might come towards the end. And then the hover styles come toward the end, the focus styles come towards the end, and even the responsive modifiers, they all come together, and things like that. So that's one plugin.
That's so cool.
Which you can right, just go and explore. For productivity, it's just the IntelliSense plugin that I use, and sometimes inline fold. I don't use that all the time, but if I really want to focus on the markup, I use it. And then more than productivity, for information to know what's happening, there is this newsletter called Tailwind CSS Weekly, Tailwind Weekly. Yeah, that is something I absolutely recommend subscribing to. So earlier you mentioned, right, is there a place where I could go and see what are all the cool extensions or plugins that are there, and all the plugins that people have created, third-party plugins. Now this newsletter, actually she tries to scan all the new plugins or even resources, videos, blog posts that people are creating about Tailwind, and every Saturday she sends out that newsletter. You can even see the old ones. I think there are more than 200 issues already, or more than that, maybe even 350 or 400. So if you want some gems, you can simply go through those and find plugins or extensions which are really not known to many people.
You said this is weekly?
Tailwind Weekly, yeah.
What? Things changed that much? That there's a weekly newsletter with a lot of, wow, that's unbelievable.
Yeah.
Especially for, like, I just used Tailwind. I had no idea it's so rapid. It sounds like the development lifecycle itself has a Tailwind. So, okay, thank you for that. One thing about the order, the sorting prettier plugin that I noticed that has been super helpful for me also is it sort of works as a linter for class names that are not contained within the Tailwind CSS, which is so cool because it moves all of them to the end. So like if I mess up flex, and if I write like FLX or something like this, and I'm like, hey, why is my flex box not applying? Then it's just in the wrong place because it's the wrong class name. That's so cool. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. What about new features in Tailwind? As you mentioned, CSS only config. What has you going, oh, this is so cool. I can't wait to either play with it now or I can't wait to tell people about it.
Yeah. So CSS, mostly CSS first configuration. That's the one thing everyone's been excited about. And then it's also these, support for, colors like OKLCH. I don't know how it's done. I still don't know the details, but like cross-compatible support is being added for those colors. I can't, wait to start using them. And then what else? Yeah, container queries. You don't have to add a plugin anymore. You can do that. It's going to become, it will be included in the core itself. You can simply add container, and start using container queries. Those are the things I'm excited about mostly.
Fantastic. I can't wait to play with all of them, especially OKLCH. I don't really know enough about color theory to know why I would use that. But I look forward to the work of great people like Una Kravitz and Adam Argyle and even Adam to tell us about it. Awesome. Shruti, we've spent a lot of time talking about Tailwind CSS. And I think but at this point in time, like everybody's convinced you are one of the world experts on the topic. I've never seen somebody answer these questions. And some of them are very difficult questions, right? I've never seen anyone answer them with such ease and fluency. It just means you're just really, really confident in it. In fact, like I'm reminded of the great Dr. Feynman, the physicist who said like the mark of whether someone truly understands something is that they're comfortable explaining it to a child. Not that I'm a child, but you have a lot of comfort in explaining this stuff. I'd like to spend the last few minutes we have here talking about that specifically. You specifically. How do you get there? I mean, do you just spend all day, every day reading Tailwind related material? Is there, for the vast majority of us, I mean, you mentioned you're a full stack developer. You have work to do. You have probably a family. You have consulting work. You have all these things. How did you develop such mastery in and around Tailwind?
So one thing was I needed content for my YouTube videos, right? And since Tailwind was working, right, 3 or 4 videos started getting more viewership. So I'm like, okay, now I need to go deeper and find things which people are not really aware of, but I can't simply talk about them. I have to use them. I have to have first-hand experience to talk about them. Otherwise, it'll sound very superficial and just for engagement or something. So I try and use these in the projects, whatever I'm working on, that I try to use them somewhere. If I don't find a way, I just think of a project. I might not use it anywhere at all. I might not even put it up on GitHub, nowhere, just for my learning, like this rock, paper, scissors thing. If it didn't work out, I would have obviously not created a YouTube video, but I definitely learned something. And that was CSS, but I think I was trying to look for something in Tailwind itself. That didn't work out. So I just learned something else. So I was like, okay, it's still some content. It's still something I learned. And the moment I create a YouTube video, it serves so many purposes. Other people get to know about it. And like I said, I personally have forgotten. So I also have a place to go back to and, read about it. So for me, creating content is a way of learning. I first create content so that I learn it deeper. So I write a blog post about it if I want to explore it. I can't simply write anything, right? I'll have to do that research. So while doing that is when I discovered this newsletter, discovered so many things, and emails also. I wanted to design an email. I'm like, come on, it's 2024. Don't tell me there's no way to create an email using Tailwind. There must be one already. So a simple Google search of, how to, can I design my emails with Tailwind CSS? And, a couple of things popped up. And Maisel was one of them. So I used it, and I wanted to use that in Laravel. Then I again searched how that's done, and there was a blog post that I found. So everything was broken, which is why I thought, okay, this could be my next video. I can put all of them together. And surely, since Tailwind is also like very much integrated into Laravel, a lot of people use it. It's very easy. It also comes with Breeze, which is an authentication package for Laravel. So a lot of people use Tailwind. I'm sure they would want to learn about Maisel. So, I try to, the new features that I'm excited about, I try to use them in my project in some way, in any of the projects. And once I know how it is, I even try to create the content so I learn it better.
Interesting. I think, and we'll really, I've said it a few times, but I mean it this time. We'll probably wrap up with this. I think it's what I'm hearing is like a way of working that we can extract for the listeners who want to be like you. I think, Shruti, there's a lot of people who want to be like you because you are an expert in the field. You're an excellent content creator. You are a really also phenomenal conversationalist. For people who want to sort of replicate that, it sounds like what they can do is try a bunch of things. That's what you were doing, right? You were just like PHP, CSS, whatever. You put out a bunch of content just because you wanted to create content. And then you noticed, oh, wait, people are paying attention. You sort of found product market fit, so to speak. You found where the demand is. And you're like, okay, this thing, the niche, right? And the way you found the niche was by trying everything until one thing worked. And then you're like, okay, this is cool. And then you didn't, I love what you said. You wanted to have substance. You didn't want to just, be a quote unquote empty influencer. So then you decided, okay, there is demand here. I'm going to really educate myself and start building things with Tailwind. And you did that until you felt comfortable, but then you kept sort of pushing the boundaries because you get ideas. And I think this is true. You can tell me if you agree or not. The more you know about something, the more like ideas you have, that maybe even weird ideas, but you're like, oh, come on, how can there be no way to do this? And then you think about it, and then you go do research, and it sort of then becomes like a snowball, like a recursive function, where in the end you're just like so far ahead of where you started that sometimes even you don't recognize it looking back. Does that resonate at all?
Absolutely. Yeah, you said it so well. That's true.
Awesome. I think that's super useful for a lot of folks. Personally, I see a lot of that in myself. So, like, I also have to sometimes go back to podcast episodes where I've talked to people like yourself and what did they say about that thing? I need to. So I really appreciate it. Anyway, listen, Shruti, it's been such an absolute pleasure. I've been looking forward to this for so long. There was reschedulings and things that got in the way, but I'm so happy we found the time to do it. You've taken us on such a journey. I mean, like from starting out with your content and finding your niche and then going so deep. We talked about dynamic classes and how they differ from static classes and the layer thing that I didn't even know that I feel super confident in. I think what we do on the podcast is we eliminate imposter syndrome and we sort of celebrate the beauty of engineering. We say that in every intro. And I think you've definitely helped us do that. You've helped me do that personally. So on behalf of myself and all the listeners, thank you so much for coming on here. It's been an absolute joy.
Yeah, it's been so lovely talking to you. Thank you so much for inviting.
Thanks again. Thank you for joining my discussion with Shruti Balasa. I hope you learned a ton as I did. I hope you learned when to use Tailwind, when not to use Tailwind, what Tailwind is good for, what Tailwind is not good for, and also that Tailwind is really no substitute to good practices you should already have in your code base and the accessibility they should implement. If you're learning from and or enjoying this content, I'd invite you, if you're watching on YouTube, to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with your feedback. If you're listening on Apple and or Spotify, then I'd invite you to leave up to a 5-star review. All of this is a great way to support the podcast and make sure it continues. If you want to share this on social media as well, I will not stop you. Thank you so much for sticking around. Thank you for being a part of the podcast. And most importantly, thank you for your interest in engineering.